Kael nodded, his grin fading as he adjusted his grip on his dagger. Ready. Zayn clenched his fists, the energy of the artifact surging within him. He could feel the conductor's core crackling in his veins, the veil of night coiling around him like a protective shadow, and the stone of singularity burning brightly in his chest. As I'll ever be. Together, they pushed the doors open, the heavy iron groaning under their weight. The throne room was enormous, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness. Rivers of molten metal flowed along the edges of the room, casting an orange glow that flickered across the obsidian floor. At the far end of the chamber sat Rhaziel, his throne forged from a twisted amalgamation of steel and fire. Rhaziel was a towering figure, his body encased in gleaming black armor that pulsed with molten veins. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and his presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. In his hand, he held a massive halberd, its blade glowing red-hot. "You've come far," Rhaziel said, his voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very walls. "But you should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." Kael stepped forward, his dagger gleaming in the molten light. "We're not afraid of you." Rhaziel chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Bravery is commendable, but it won't save you." Zayn stepped beside Kael, his hands sparking with electricity as the artifacts flared to life. "You've ruled long enough, Rhaziel. It's time for your reign to end." Rhaziel's eyes narrowed, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise. "Then come, little champions. Let me show you the price of defiance." The battle begins. Rhaziel moved with impossible speed for someone so massive, his halberd slicing through the air in a fiery arc. Zayn dodged to the side, the heat of the blade searing his skin even from a distance. Kael darted forward, his dagger flashing as he aimed for Rhaziel's exposed joints, but the tyrant swatted him aside with a flick of his gauntlet hand. "You think to challenge me with such pitiful strength?" Rhaziel sneered, his molten gaze fixed on Zayn. Zayn raised his hands, the electricity within him crackling to life. A surge of energy erupted from his palms, striking Rhaziel's chest and sending him staggering back. The shadows from the veil coiled around Zayn, lashing out like living tendrils and slicing into Rhaziel's armor. Rhaziel roared, molten metal dripping from the gashes in his armor as he raised his halberd. He slammed the blade into the ground, and the floor erupted in a wave of molten steel that surged toward Zayn and Kael. "Move!" Kael shouted, diving to the side. Zayn threw up a barrier of shadow, the molten wave crashing against it and dissipating into steam. He gritted his teeth, the strain of maintaining the barrier leaving him breathless. "We can't let him control the fight." Kael nodded, circling around Rhaziel and aiming for his flank. The brothers attacked in tandem, Kael's quick strikes keeping Rhaziel off balance, while Zayn unleashed bursts of electricity and shadow. The combined assault began to wear on the tyrant, cracks forming in his molten armor. Rhaziel's true power, but Rhaziel was far from defeated. With a roar, he raised his halberd, and the molten rivers along the edges of the room surged upward, forming a swirling vortex of liquid metal. The molten steel coalesced around him, reforming his armor and enhancing his already massive frame. "You cannot defeat me," Rhaziel snarled, his voice echoing with raw power. "I am the embodiment of metal, unbreakable and eternal." Zayn's heart pounded as he felt the energy within him flare in response. The artifacts seemed to pulse with urgency, their combined power surging as if guiding him. "This ends now," Zayn said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. He focused on the stone of singularity, its energy burning brightly as he channeled its power. The air around him shimmered, and the shadows from the veil blended with the crackling electricity of the core. The energy swirled into a concentrated sphere that pulsed with blinding light and darkness. Kael darted forward, his movements a blur as he kept Rhaziel's attention focused on him. "Make it count, Zayn," he shouted. Zayn raised the sphere, its energy trembling with barely contained power. He took a deep breath, his focus unyielding as he hurled the sphere at Rhaziel. The impact was catastrophic. The sphere exploded in a brilliant flash of light and shadow, the energy ripping through the room and sending molten steel flying in all directions. Rhaziel roared, his armor cracking and his body collapsing under the force of the blast. When the light faded, Rhaziel lay motionless, his molten form reduced to smoldering fragments. The throne room was silent, save for the faint hum of the artifact still glowing in Zayn's hands. The aftermath, Kael limped to Zayn's side, his grin weak but triumphant. "You did it, little brother. You actually did it." Zayn sank to his knees, his chest heaving as the weight of the battle settled over him. The artifacts dimmed, their energy retreating into him as the tension in the air faded. "It's over," Zayn said, his voice trembling. "Rhaziel is gone." Kael clapped him on the back, his laughter light despite the pain in his eyes. Not bad for a kid who used to trip over his own feet. Zayn managed a small smile, though his thoughts were already turning to what lay ahead. The tyranny of Rhaziel was over, but the burden of the artifacts remained, and the responsibility to rebuild their broken world rested on his shoulders. "We have a lot of work to do," Zayn said, his voice quiet but resolute. Kael nodded, his grin fading into a determined expression. "Then let's get started." Together, the brothers stepped out of the fortress, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, the future felt like their own. Chapter 17. The weight of the eternal, the morning sun rose over the ruined land, its light cutting through the lingering shadows of Rhaziel's reign. Zayn and Kael stood at the fortress's edge, staring out over the scorched plains. The heat of battle still clung to the air, but the oppressive weight of Rhaziel's presence was gone. Zayn adjusted the pack on his back, where the remnants of the artifacts now rested. The conductor's core, veil of night, and stone of singularity had merged their energies within him, leaving behind only faint physical traces, a subtle hum of power that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The world felt different now, quieter, yet heavier, as if it were waiting for him to take the next step. "You all right?" Kael asked, breaking the silence. Zayn turned to his brother, exhaustion etched into his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "It feels wrong, like this isn't over." Kael gave him a weary grin, though the light in his eyes was dimmer than usual. "It's over, Zayn. We won. Rhaziel's gone, his soldiers are scattered, and this land can finally breathe again. You did it." Zayn nodded, but the gnawing unease in his chest didn't fade. The artifact's power hadn't dissipated. It had simply settled within him, a constant reminder of the burden he now carried. The burden of power. As they descended the steps of the fortress, Zayn felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The devastation Rhaziel had wrought was vast, and rebuilding their world felt like an insurmountable task. "We should head back to the villages," Kael said as they walked. "Let them know Rhaziel's gone. Give them hope." Zayn hesitated. "What if they don't trust us? What if they see me as dangerous?" Kael stopped, turning to face him. "You're not Rhaziel, Zayn. You don't rule with fear or violence. You fought for them, for us. They'll see that." "But the power," Zayn said, clenching his fists. "It's too much. I don't know how to control it." Kael placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "Then you learn, just like you learned to fight, to survive, to lead. You're stronger than you think, little brother. Darian saw it, and so do I." Zayn swallowed hard, Kael's words igniting a flicker of determination within him. "I hope you're right." Return to the villages. The journey back to the villages was long and silent. The broken land stretched endlessly before them, the cracked earth a stark reminder of the damage Rhaziel had caused. As they crossed into fertile lowlands, the signs of life began to return, fields overgrown with wildflowers, streams flowing freely, and the distant sound of children's laughter. The first village they approached was small, its stone and wood houses huddled together beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint smell of baking bread hung in the air. It was a scene of quiet resilience, a glimpse of what their world could become. Kael raised a hand in greeting as they entered the village square. The villagers stared at them with wide eyes, their expressions a mix of fear and curiosity. "Rhaziel is gone," Kael announced, his voice carrying across the square. "The tyrant is dead, and his rule is over." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some skeptical, others hopeful. An older man stepped forward, his weathered face etched with lines of hardship. "And who are you to say this?" he asked, his tone cautious. Kael gestured to Zayn. "This is Zayn, the one who ended Rhaziel's reign. He's the reason we're free." Zayn felt the weight of their stares, his chest tightening. He raised his hands, sparks of electricity flickering faintly as shadows curled around him. "It's true," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Rhaziel's power is gone, but the scars he left behind. We'll need to heal them together." The villagers whispered among themselves, their eyes lingering on Zayn's display of power. Finally, the old man stepped forward, his expression softening. "If what you say is true, then we owe you our lives. But power like yours is dangerous. How can we trust you?" Zayn met the man's gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Because I've seen what happens when power is used for control. I won't make the same mistakes. I'll protect this world, not rule it." The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you have our thanks." A leader's burden the villagers slowly began to warm to the brothers, their fear giving way to cautious hope. They offered food and shelter, their gratitude palpable in every gesture. As night fell, Zayn and Kael sat by a fire in the center of the village, surrounded by people eager to hear their story. Kael recounted their journey with his usual flair, his voice animated as he described their trials. The villagers listened intently, their expressions shifting from awe to sorrow to triumph as he spoke. Zayn remained quiet, his thoughts elsewhere. The power of the artifacts hummed faintly within him, a constant reminder of the responsibility he now bore. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, their hope and trust tied to his actions. As the fire crackled and the villagers began to drift away, Kael turned to Zayn, his grin fading. "You're thinking too much again." Zayn sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, Kael. To lead, to protect, to be more than I am." Kael's expression softened, and he clapped Zayn on the back. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. The people are here. And whether you like it or not, you're already leading. You've been doing it since the moment we left the work camps." Zayn met his brother's gaze, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. "Thanks, Kael." Kael smirked. "Don't mention it. Now get some rest. We've got a lot of work to do." The next step as the village fell silent under the blanket of night, Zayn sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. The power within him felt calmer now, less volatile, but still immense. He could feel the potential it held, the ability to reshape the world and protect it from those who sought to harm it. For the first time, he began to understand the true weight of his responsibility. Rhaziel's reign was over, but the challenges ahead were just as daunting. Rebuilding their world would take time, effort, and unwavering resolve. But as he looked toward the horizon, where the first stars of the night began to appear, Zayn felt a spark of hope. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't afraid. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 18. Protector of the Reclaimed, the first light of dawn bathed the village in a soft, golden glow. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of Rhaziel's domain. Zayn sat on the edge of the village's central well, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The morning's peace felt fragile, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Kael approached, his movements slow and deliberate after the weariness of their journey. He carried 2 wooden bowls of porridge, the steam rising in thin wisps. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing one to Zayn. "Thanks," Zayn said quietly, accepting the bowl. He stared into the porridge for a moment before taking a small bite. The simple meal tasted better than anything he could remember, a stark reminder of how far they'd come from the days of starvation and servitude. Kael leaned against the well, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet since last night, still thinking about what comes next." Zayn nodded, his grip tightening around the bowl. "It's just, everything feels so big now. Rhaziel's gone, but the world is broken. People are scared, and then there's this." He gestured vaguely to himself, the faint glow of the artifact's energy still visible around him. "How do I lead when I don't even know what I am anymore?" Kael placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You're still Zayn, the kid who survived the work camps, who fought his way through storms and shadows, who refused to give up no matter how hard it got. You're not Rhaziel. You don't want power for power's sake. You want to protect people." Zayn looked up, meeting Kael's gaze. "What if I fail?" Kael smirked, his usual confidence shining through. "Then you try again, and again. That's what makes you different. You don't stop." First steps a day passed quickly as Zayn and Kael worked alongside the villagers. They helped rebuild homes, repaired tools, and restored fields that had been neglected under Rhaziel's reign. The villagers were cautious at first, wary of Zayn's power, but his willingness to roll up his sleeves and work with them began to ease their fears. By midday, a group of children gathered around Zayn, their wide eyes filled with curiosity. One boy, no older than 10, pointed at the faint sparks that danced along Zayn's fingertips. "Is it true you can control lightning?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. Zayn hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I can." "Can you show us?" Another child chimed in. Kael chuckled from where he was hammering a broken wool back into shape. "Careful, Zayn. If you start showing off, they'll never leave you alone." Zayn smiled, the children's enthusiasm infectious. He raised his hand, letting a small arc of electricity spark between his fingers. The children gasped, their faces lighting up with awe. "Do it again," one of them shouted, clapping excitedly. Zayn obliged, this time letting the electricity form a tiny, flickering shape that danced in the air before vanishing. The children cheered, their laughter echoing through the village square. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zayn felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the world they were trying to rebuild. A shadow wafted out as the sun set and the villagers gathered for an evening meal. Zayn slipped away to the outskirts of the village. The energy of the artifacts still hummed within him, a constant reminder of the power he now held. He sat beneath a sprawling oak tree, staring at his hands as the shadows from the veil of night coiled faintly around his fingers. "You've come far," a voice said, breaking the silence. Zayn jumped to his feet, his electricity sparking instinctively. A familiar figure stepped out from the shadows, Darian, his weathered face illuminated by the faint glow of the artifacts. "Darian," Zayn said, his chest tightening. "How? Why are you here?" The older man smiled faintly. "I've been watching. You've done what many thought impossible, defeating Rhaziel, reclaiming the artifacts, and giving the people hope. But your journey is far from over." Zayn's shoulders sagged, the weight of Darian's words pressing down on him. I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "The power. It's too much. I don't even know how to control it." Darian stepped closer, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Zayn's. "That power chose you for a reason. The artifacts don't simply grant their strength. They test the heart and will of those who seek them. You've passed every trial because you are worthy." "But what if I'm not?" Zayn asked, his voice trembling. "What if I become like Rhaziel?" Darian placed a hand on Zayn's shoulder, his expression soft but firm. "That fear is what will keep you from falling. Power does not corrupt on its own. It is the choices we make with it that define us. And I see in you a heart that seeks to protect, not to dominate." Zayn took a shaky breath, Darian's words sinking in. "What do I do now?" Darian gestured to the village behind them. "Rebuild. Protect. Lead. The people need someone to guide them, someone to inspire hope. And when the time comes, you will face greater challenges, forces beyond this world that threaten not just your land, but your very existence. Zayn's brow furrowed. What do you mean? What forces? Darian's gaze grew distant, his voice dropping to a grave tone. The power of the artifacts is tied to the very fabric of the multiverse. There are others who seek to control that power, beings who would tear apart your world to claim it. But that is a battle for another day. A protectoress oath as Darian faded back into the shadows. Zayn sat beneath the oak tree, his thoughts a whirlwind. The weight of his responsibility felt heavier than ever, but Darian's words had sparked something within him, a quiet resolve to rise to the challenge. He returned to the village, where Kael greeted him with a knowing smile. Big speech from the Shadow Man? Zayn chuckled softly. Something like that. Kael clapped him on the back. Well, whatever he said, just remember, you're not alone in this. Zayn nodded, his chest swelling with determination. I know, and I won't let anyone down. As the stars blanketed the night sky, Zayn stood at the edge of the village, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. He wasn't just a survivor or a fighter anymore. He was a protector, a guardian of his world, and he wouldn't stop until it was safe. Chapter 19. The call beyond the days that followed were a blur of activity. Zayn and Kael worked tirelessly alongside the villagers, rebuilding homes, planting crops, and reinforcing the sense of unity that had been missing for so long. Despite the hard labor, Zayn found solace in the routine. It gave him time to think, to process everything that had happened, and everything that was still to come. But the peace was fleeting. The artifact's energy pulsed within him more frequently now, their combined power a constant hum in his mind. At first, he thought it was a lingering effect of the trials, but soon the pulses began to feel purposeful, like a call he couldn't ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zayn sat alone at the edge of the village. The air was cool, and the faint scent of wildflowers lingered in the breeze. He closed his eyes, focusing on the energy coursing through him. The artifacts flared suddenly, their power surging like a tidal wave. Zayn gasped, clutching his chest as visions flooded his mind, shattered worlds, distant stars, and a swirling void that seemed to stretch infinitely. He saw figures cloaked in shadow and light, their forms shifting as they moved through the chaos. One voice cut through the din, deep and resonant. Protector. The balance is fragile. Zayn's eyes snapped open, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around, but the village was quiet, the stars above twinkling innocently. The voice echoed faintly in his mind, leaving a chill in its wake. What was that? He whispered, his hands trembling. A warning in the night the following morning. Zayn confided in Kael as they worked to repair the village's outer wall. The steady rhythm of hammering nails provided a semblance of normalcy as he recounted the vision. Kael frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. Shattered worlds? Voices in your head. That doesn't sound good. Zayn nodded, his grip tightening on the wooden beam he was holding. It felt massive, like whatever's out there makes Rhaziel look like a child playing with fire. Kael leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. Darian mentioned forces beyond our world. Maybe this is what he meant. Zayn sighed, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. If the artifacts are connected to the multiverse, then maybe that power is what's drawing them here. But why me? Why now? Kael shrugged, his grin faint but reassuring. Because you're the one who can handle it. Look, I don't understand half of what you're dealing with, but I do know one thing. You've faced impossible odds before, and you've come out stronger every time. Zayn managed a small smile. Thanks, Kael. That means a lot. Kael clapped him on the shoulder. Don't mention it. Now, let's finish this wall before the whole village falls apart. The rift opens that night. Zayn's visions returned, more vivid and intense than before. He saw a vast, swirling vortex of energy, a rift tearing through the fabric of reality. Tendrils of light and shadow reached out from the rift, grasping at the stars and pulling them into the void. A figure emerged from the chaos, its form obscured by a blinding light. Zayn could feel its presence, a force so overwhelming it made the artifact's power seem insignificant. The voice returned, louder and more urgent this time. The balance must be maintained. Protect the realm, or all will fall. When Zayn woke, his body was drenched in sweat, and the air crackled faintly around him. The energy of the artifacts pulsed in time with his heartbeat, their combined power resonating with a force he couldn't comprehend. He sat up, his mind racing. The visions weren't just warnings. They were a call to action. A visit from Darian as dawn broke. Zayn found himself standing at the edge of the village, staring toward the horizon. The morning air was crisp, but the weight in his chest made it hard to breathe. He clenched his fists, the energy within him flaring faintly. "You've felt it, haven't you?" A familiar voice said from behind him. Zayn turned to see Darian stepping out of the shadows, his weathered face etched with concern. "The rift," Zayn said, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "It's real." Darian nodded, his piercing blue eyes scanning the horizon. "It is, and it is growing. The artifacts are tied to the balance of the multiverse. When that balance is disrupted, the rift opens, threatening to consume everything." Zayn frowned, his hands trembling. "Why me? Why did the artifacts choose me?" Darian stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because you have the strength to resist their corruption and the heart to wield their power wisely. But make no mistake, Zayn, this is not a burden you can shoulder alone. The multiverse is vast, and there are others who seek to protect it." Zayn's eyes narrowed. "Others? Who are they?" Darian's expression darkened. "Guardians, like yourself, chosen across realms to maintain the balance. But not all who seek the artifacts do so for noble reasons. There are those who would use their power to destroy, to dominate." The weight of Darian's words settled over Zayn like a heavy cloak. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How do I stop the rift?" Darian placed a hand on Zayn's shoulder, his grip firm. "You must travel to its source. The artifacts will guide you, but the journey will be perilous. The forces you face will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." A new quest as Darian faded into the shadows once more. Zayn turned back to the village, his resolve hardening. The visions, the rift, the warnings, they all pointed to one undeniable truth. His journey was far from over. When he found Kael in the village square, his brother was sharpening his dagger, a faint smirk on his face. "You've got that look again," Kael said without looking up. "What's the plan?" Zayn took a deep breath, his voice steady. "We're leaving. The rift is real, and it's growing. If we don't stop it, everything we've fought for will be destroyed." Kael sheathed his dagger, his grin widening. "Another impossible mission? Sounds like fun. Let's go." As the brothers prepared to set out, Zayn felt the artifact's energy flare, their power resonating with a sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges would be greater than anything they had faced before. But for the first time, Zayn felt ready. He wasn't just fighting for his world anymore. He was fighting for the multiverse. Chapter 20. The rift as the road ahead was unlike anything Zayn or Kael had experienced before. As they traveled beyond the familiar lands of their world, the terrain grew stranger with each passing mile. The sky seemed to ripple, shifting in color from pale blue to deep violet, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. The air was thick with an unnatural hum, a sound that resonated deep within Zayn's chest, amplifying the energy of the artifacts. Kael adjusted the strap of his pack, his eyes scanning the strange horizon. "So, how do we know when we're close to this rift thing?" he asked, his voice laced with nervous humor. "Does it come with a welcome sign?" Zayn glanced at his brother, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I think we'll know. The artifacts. They're pulling me toward it. I can feel it getting stronger. Kael's grin faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. Well, as long as they're not pulling you off a cliff, I guess we're in good shape. Signs of the rift by midday. The landscape had transformed into a twisted, otherworldly expanse. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and glowing faintly, as if the earth itself was bleeding light. Strange, crystalline structures jutted out of the ground, their surfaces reflecting distorted images of the brothers as they passed. This place is wrong, Kael muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. It feels like it doesn't belong. Zayn nodded, the artifact's energy pulsing more intensely now. The rift is tearing through reality. It's pulling pieces from other worlds, other dimensions, and scattering them here. Kael frowned, kicking a loose shard of crystal that shattered into a puff of glowing dust. And this is supposed to be the easy part. Zayn didn't answer. His focus was fixed on the horizon, where a faint, swirling light had begun to appear. It shimmered like a distant storm, its tendrils of energy reaching upward into the fractured sky. There it is, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The rift. Kael followed his gaze, his expression hardening. Guess we'd better pick up the pace. The first guardian as they approached the rift, the hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through their bones. The swirling light intensified, casting strange shadows across the cracked ground. Zayn's chest tightened as the energy of the artifacts surged, their combined power resonating with the rift's chaotic force. We're not alone, Kael said, his voice low. Zayn followed his brother's gaze and saw a figure standing near the base of the rift. It was humanoid in shape, but its body was composed of shifting, crystalline shards that glowed with an inner light. Its eyes burned with an intense golden hue, and its movements were slow and deliberate as it turned to face them. You have come to the edge of the rift, the figure said, its voice resonating like a chorus of broken glass. Who are you to approach the boundary of existence? Zayn stepped forward, his hands sparking with electricity. I'm Zayn. The artifacts chose me to protect this world, and I won't let the rift destroy it. The figure tilted its head, its golden eyes narrowing. The artifacts grant power, but they do not grant wisdom. If you seek to close the rift, you must first prove your resolve. Kael drew his dagger, stepping beside Zayn. Is that your way of saying you're going to fight us? The figure raised an arm, and the air around it shimmered as crystalline shards formed into jagged blades. Only one with the strength to command the balance may approach the rift. Show me your worth. Zayn's heart raced as the figure advanced, its crystalline weapons glinting in the fractured light. He raised his hands, the energy of the artifacts surging to life. A battle-off power, the Guardian moved with blinding speed, its crystalline blades slicing through the air. Zayn dodged the first strike, the electricity within him crackling as he retaliated with a burst of energy. The lightning struck the Guardian, sending shards of crystal flying. But the figure quickly reformed, its golden eyes glowing brighter. Kael darted in from the side, his dagger flashing as he aimed for the Guardian's core. The blade struck true, embedding itself in the glowing crystal at the figure's center, but the Guardian let out a resonant laugh. You fight well, but strength alone will not suffice, it said, its voice reverberating through the air. Zayn gritted his teeth, the shadows from the veil of night coiling around him. He focused on the stone of singularity, its power burning brightly as he channeled it into a concentrated burst. The ground beneath the Guardian trembled as the energy struck, sending it staggering back. Kael withdrew his dagger, his grin sharp. I think we're starting to make it mad. The Guardian raised its arms, and shards of crystal shot toward the brothers like a storm of blades. Zayn threw up a barrier of shadow, the shards shattering harmlessly against it, but the strain left him gasping for breath. This isn't working, Zayn said, his voice tight. We need to do something different. Kael glanced at the Guardian, his eyes narrowing. Its core, that's the key. We have to hit it together. Zayn nodded, his grip tightening on the artifact's power. Let's end this. The final strike, as the Guardian lunged, Zayn and Kael moved in unison. Zayn unleashed a surge of electricity and shadow, the combined energy crackling as it struck the Guardian's crystalline form. Kael darted forward, his dagger glowing faintly as he drove it into the Guardian's core with all his strength. The Guardian let out a resonant cry, its body fracturing and splintering into shards of light. The core pulsed brightly before exploding in a burst of energy that sent the brothers staggering back. When the light faded, the Guardian was gone, and the air around the rift grew still. Zayn fell to his knees, his chest heaving as the artifact's power settled within him once more. Kael sat beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. Well, that was fun. Let's not do it again anytime soon. Zayn managed a weak laugh, though his gaze remained fixed on the rift. Its swirling light seemed calmer now, but the chaotic energy within it was still palpable. This is just the beginning, Zayn said quietly. There's more out there, more guardians, more threats. But we have to keep going. Kael clapped him on the back, his grin returning. Then let's keep going. We've got a rift to close. Together, the brothers rose and stepped closer to the rift, their determination unshaken. The multiverse hung in the balance, and their journey was far from over. Chapter 21. Into the rift loomed before them, its swirling energy a mix of light and shadow, chaos and order. Tendrils of shimmering force extended outward, reaching for the fractured sky as if trying to grasp the world itself. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating with the energy of the artifacts within Zayn. Kael stood at Zayn's side, his dagger gleaming faintly in the rift's light. So, what happens when we step in there? He asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and trepidation. Do we get turned into energy spaghetti, or... Zayn shook his head, though uncertainty gnawed at him. I don't know. But the artifacts, he raised his hand, where faint sparks of electricity mingled with tendrils of shadow. They're guiding me. I think we're supposed to go through. Kael let out a dry laugh. Great. Blind faith and glowing trinkets. What could possibly go wrong? Despite his words, Kael adjusted his pack and stepped closer to the rift. Zayn took a deep breath, the energy within him pulsing in time with the rift's chaotic rhythm. Ready? Kael grinned, though his eyes were serious. Always. Together, they stepped into the light. The rift's heart, the world around them, dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes, shifting and swirling in ways that defied logic. Zayn felt weightless, as if he were floating through a void where time and space had no meaning. The energy of the artifacts flared within him, stabilizing his senses as he clung to their presence like an anchor. Kael's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. Zayn, are you seeing this? Zayn turned to find his brother drifting beside him, his form outlined by a faint golden glow. Beyond Kael, fragments of other worlds floated through the void, shattered landscapes, pieces of buildings and fragments of stars suspended in the swirling light. This is the rift, Zayn said, awe and dread mingling in his voice. It's pulling in pieces of reality from other dimensions. Kael frowned, his eyes scanning the fragments. Then we're not alone. Zayn followed his brother's gaze and froze. Emerging from the swirling light was a massive creature, its form shifting and unstable, as if it were made of pure energy. It had no discernible features, only a blinding core of light surrounded by writhing tendrils of darkness. The creature let out a deafening roar that shook the void. Zayn felt the energy of the artifacts flare in response, their combined power pushing back against the creature's overwhelming presence. Let me guess, Kael said, his dagger already in hand. It's not here to welcome us. Zayn raised his hands, electricity sparking to life as the shadows from the veil of night coiled around him. We can't let it stop us. If we don't close the rift, everything we've fought for will be destroyed. The rift-born the creature lunged, its tendrils of light and shadow slicing through the void with terrifying speed. Zayn dodged the first strike, releasing a burst of electricity that crackled through the air and struck the creature's core. The energy rippled across its surface but didn't slow it down. Kael darted forward, his movements quick and precise as he aimed for the creature's tendrils. His dagger struck true, severing one of the writhing appendages, but the creature roared and lashed out, sending him spinning into the void. "Kael!" Zayn shouted, his heart pounding as he released another surge of energy. The shadows from the veil lashed out like whips, striking the creature's core and forcing it back. "I'm fine." Kael's voice came from the distance, followed by the flash of his dagger as he struck again. "Just keep it distracted." Zayn gritted his teeth, the artifact's power surging within him as he focused on the stone of singularity. The ground beneath his feet, if it could even be called ground, trembled as he channeled the stone's energy into a concentrated burst of force. The energy struck the creature's core, and for a moment, the light around it dimmed. The creature roared, its form destabilizing as cracks spread across its surface. "It's working," Zayn shouted. "Focus on the core." Kael nodded, his movements a blur as he dodged the creature's thrashing tendrils. Together, the brothers unleashed a relentless assault, Zayn's burst of energy and Kael's precision strikes wearing down the creature's defenses. Finally, with a deafening cry, the creature shattered into fragments of light and shadow that dissolved into the void. The rift speaks as the creature's remnants faded. The rift pulsed, its swirling light growing brighter. Zayn felt a strange warmth wash over him, followed by a voice that resonated deep within his mind. "You have proven your resolve, Protector, but the balance remains fragile. The rift cannot be closed from this side. You must journey further to the Nexus." Zayn's heart raced. "The Nexus? What is that?" The voice was quiet for a moment before answering. "The Nexus is the heart of the multiverse, where all realities converge. It is where you will find the key to sealing the rift. But be warned, the forces that seek to claim the artifacts will follow you there." Kael floated closer, his expression serious. "Sounds like a trap." "It's not a trap," Zayn said, his voice firm. "It's our only chance." The voice continued, its tone grave. "The Nexus is far from here, and the journey will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. But if you succeed, the balance will be restored and the rift will close." Zayn nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll go." The voice faded, and the swirling light of the rift began to shift, forming a portal that glowed with an intense, golden light. Zayn turned to Kael, his chest tight with anticipation. "This is it. Are you ready?" Kael smirked, though there was a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "Always. Just don't get us killed, all right?" Zayn smiled, the energy of the artifacts flaring as he stepped toward the portal. Together, the brothers entered the golden light, their journey to the Nexus and the heart of the multiverse beginning. Chapter 22. The road to the Nexus. As Zayn and Kael stepped through the golden portal, they were enveloped in a wave of warmth and light. The air around them hummed with an energy unlike anything they'd felt before, calm yet infinitely powerful. When the light faded, they found themselves standing on a vast, crystalline expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The ground beneath their feet shimmered like glass, reflecting the stars above and forming a mirror image of the infinite sky. Suspended in the distance were massive orbs of swirling energy, each pulsating with a unique rhythm and color. They floated serenely, tethered to the expanse by threads of light. Kael whistled, his voice breaking the silence. "Well, this is something. I'm guessing this isn't home?" Zayn shook his head, the energy of the artifacts pulsing faintly in response to the strange environment. "No, this must be the path to the Nexus." Kael knelt and tapped the crystalline surface with his dagger, the sound ringing out like a chime. "And what's stopping us from just walking straight there?" Before Zayn could answer, a faint ripple spread across the expanse, and the air grew heavy. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the space. "The Nexus is not for the unworthy. You must prove yourselves to continue. Kael groaned, standing and sheathing his dagger. Of course, it's never easy. A test of trust, the crystalline expanse shimmered, and two paths emerged before the brothers. One was bathed in golden light, its surface smooth and inviting. The other was dark and jagged, with shards of crystal jutting out at sharp angles. The easy way or the hard way? Kael asked, eyeing the paths. Zayn frowned, the energy of the artifacts resonating faintly as he stepped closer. This is a test. It's not about the path, it's about us. Kael raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Before Zayn could explain, the voice returned. One path leads forward, the other to oblivion. But the choice is not yours alone. To proceed, you must trust each other. Kael crossed his arms. Great. Cryptic riddles and high stakes. My favorite combination. Zayn glanced at the two paths, his mind racing. It's about trust, he repeated. You choose the path for me, and I choose the path for you. Kael blinked, his grin fading as he realized the weight of the test. If we're wrong, we won't be, Zayn said firmly. I trust you. Kael hesitated, his expression uncharacteristically serious. All right, little brother, I'll go first. He studied the two paths, his eyes narrowing. Finally, he pointed to the jagged path. That one. You've always been better at fighting through the tough stuff. Zayn nodded, stepping onto the jagged path without hesitation. The moment his foot touched the surface, the crystalline expanse shimmered, and the path solidified beneath him. Kael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, that's a relief. Zayn turned to him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Your turn. Zayn studied the golden path, his instincts guiding him. That one, he said, pointing. You've always known how to find the easiest way through a hard situation. Kael grinned. Flattery will get you everywhere. He stepped onto the golden path, and it too solidified beneath him. The shimmering expanse grew brighter, and the voice returned, softer this time. You have proven your bond. Continue, and may your trust guide you. A stranger among the stars as they continued along the crystalline expanse, the floating orbs of energy grew larger, their colors shifting in mesmerizing patterns. Zayn felt the energy of the artifacts resonating more strongly with each step, as if they were drawing closer to their source. Kael broke the silence, his voice low. Do you feel that? Like the air's getting heavier? Zayn nodded. The nexus is close. The artifacts can feel it. Before Kael could respond, a figure appeared ahead of them, stepping out from one of the glowing orbs. The figure was tall and clad in flowing robes that shimmered like liquid silver. Their face was obscured by a mask, its surface smooth and reflective. Travelers, the figure said, their voice melodic and calm. You approach the nexus, but the path ahead is fraught with danger. Kael raised an eyebrow. And you are? The figure inclined their head. A keeper of the balance. My task is to ensure that those who seek the nexus are prepared for what lies beyond. Zayn stepped forward, his hand sparking faintly with electricity. We're here to close the rift. If you're a keeper, you know what's at stake. The keeper studied him for a long moment before nodding. The rift threatens all realities. To face it, you will need allies, and enemies will seek to stop you at every turn. Kael crossed his arms. Allies, huh? You volunteering. The keeper's mask seemed to glint with faint amusement. My place is here, but others will find you, some who wish to aid you, and others who seek to claim the artifacts for themselves. The keeper raised a hand, and a small orb of light appeared, floating between them. Take this. It will guide you to the nexus and alert you to dangers along the way. Zayn reached out, the orb pulsing faintly as it settled into his hand. The energy within it resonated with the artifacts, its light blending with their glow. Thank you, Zayn said, his voice sincere. The keeper nodded. Remember, the nexus is not the end. It is only the beginning. A fateful encounter as the brothers continued. The orb of light floated ahead of them, casting a steady glow that illuminated the path. The crystalline expanse began to shift, the shards forming strange, jagged shapes that loomed like frozen waves. Kael glanced at Zayn, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. "Do you think we'll run into these others the Keeper mentioned?" Before Zayn could answer, a low growl echoed through the expanse. The air grew colder, and the shards of crystal around them darkened. A figure emerged from the shadows, a hulking beast with a body of jagged stone and eyes that burned with a crimson light. Zayn's chest tightened as the artifact's energy flared in response. "Get ready." The beast roared, its claws slicing through the air as it charged. Zayn raised his hands, releasing a burst of electricity that struck the creature's chest. The impact sent it staggering back, but it quickly recovered, its glowing eyes locking onto him. Kael darted to the side, his movements quick and fluid. He slashed at the beast's flank, his dagger leaving deep gashes in its stony hide. The creature howled in pain, swiping at Kael with a massive claw. "Zayn!" Kael shouted. "A little help here?" Zayn focused, channeling the energy of the Stone of Singularity. The ground beneath the beast trembled, and a surge of force erupted upward, sending the creature sprawling. As it struggled to rise, Zayn unleashed a final burst of energy, the shadows from the veil of night lashing out and striking the beast's core. The creature let out one last roar before collapsing into a pile of shattered crystal. The expanse grew quiet once more, the glowing orb hovering silently ahead. Kael let out a breath, his grin returning. "Well, that was fun. Let's not make it a habit." Zayn managed a small smile, though his focus remained on the path ahead. The Nexus awaited, and with it, the ultimate test of their strength and resolve. Chapter 23. The Nexus revealed the crystalline expanse grew denser as Zayn and Kael pressed forward, the floating orbs of energy now closer and larger. Their swirling patterns were hypnotic, shifting in and out of forms that seemed both familiar and alien. Glimpses of other worlds, fragments of lives Zayn couldn't begin to understand. The golden orb given to them by the Keeper floated ahead, its light steady and calm, guiding them through the maze of jagged shards. Kael tilted his head, watching one of the larger orbs as they passed. Inside, a city gleamed, its towers made of shimmering glass that stretched into a green-hued sky. "You think those are other worlds?" he asked, his voice low. Zayn nodded, his gaze fixed on the path. "The Keeper said the Nexus is where all realities converge. These must be pieces of them, fragments caught in the rift." Kael frowned, his hand brushing the hilt of his dagger. "Let's hope we don't end up as fragments ourselves." A threshold off power, the air grew heavier as they continued, the hum of energy around them rising to a crescendo. The ground beneath their feet began to glow with a faint golden light, and the orb ahead pulsed brighter, as though they were nearing their destination. Zayn stopped suddenly, his chest tightening as a surge of energy rippled through him. The artifacts flared in response, their combined power resonating with the golden orb. "Do you feel that?" he asked, turning to Kael. Kael nodded, his expression tense. "Yeah, like the air's alive." Ahead of them, the path ended at a massive gateway formed from two towering pillars of crystal. Between the pillars, a swirling vortex of golden light spiraled endlessly, its surface shimmering with images of distant stars and galaxies. "This must be the Nexus," Zayn said, his voice filled with awe. As they stepped closer, the golden orb floated toward the gateway, its light intensifying until it dissolved into the vortex. The artifacts within Zayn pulsed in unison, their energy pulling him forward. Kael hesitated, his hand on Zayn's arm. "Before we step through, are we sure we're ready for this?" The Keeper made it sound like things get a lot worse from here. Zayn met his brother's gaze, the determination in his eyes unshaken. "We don't have a choice. If we don't close the rift, everything we know, everything we've fought for, will be gone." Kael sighed, releasing his grip. "All right, "Little brother, let's finish this." The nexus, the moment they stepped through the vortex, the world around them changed. The swirling light gave way to a vast, open space filled with towering structures of shimmering crystal and energy. The air hummed with power, and streams of light flowed through the sky like rivers, connecting the structures in an intricate web. At the center of it all was a massive, pulsating sphere of energy. It glowed with an intense golden light, its surface swirling with patterns of stars and galaxies. Zayn could feel its presence, a force so immense it made the artifacts within him feel insignificant by comparison. "This is the Nexus," Zayn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The heart of the multiverse." Kael glanced around, his eyes wide. "It's incredible." As they approached the sphere, a figure stepped out from one of the shimmering structures. The figure was tall and cloaked in robes of deep blue and silver, their face obscured by a hood. They carried a staff topped with a glowing crystal that pulsed in time with the Nexus. "Travelers," the figure said, their voice resonant and calm, "you have reached the Nexus, but your journey is far from over." Zayn stepped forward, his hands sparking faintly with energy. "We're here to close the rift. Tell us how." The figure studied him for a long moment before speaking. "The rift is a wound in the fabric of the multiverse, caused by forces seeking to claim its power for themselves. To seal it, you must restore the balance, channel the energy of the artifacts into the Nexus, and stabilize the flow of realities." Kael frowned, his grip tightening on his dagger. "Sounds straightforward. What's the catch?" The figure's gaze shifted to Kael, their voice heavy with warning. "The forces that cause the rift will not allow you to succeed. They will come for you, and they will stop at nothing to claim the artifacts." Zayn clenched his fists, the energy of the artifacts flaring within him. "Then we'll fight them." The figure nodded, their expression unreadable. "You have strength and resolve, but this task requires more than power. The Nexus is alive, and it will test your heart, your mind, and your soul. Only then will it allow you to seal the rift." The first challenge, the ground beneath them trembled as the Nexus began to shift. Streams of light spiraled around Zayn and Kael, forming a glowing ring that pulsed with energy. The figure stepped back, their voice echoing through the space. "Your first challenge begins now. Prove your worth, or the Nexus will reject you." Zayn barely had time to react before the streams of light coalesced into a massive figure, a guardian made of pure energy, its form shifting and unstable. Its eyes burned with a golden light, and its voice rumbled like thunder. "You seek to restore the balance," it said, raising a massive hand. "Prove that your heart is pure." The guardian lunged, its movement swift despite its size. Zayn raised his hands, the electricity within him crackling to life as he unleashed a burst of energy. The attack struck the guardian, but it barely flinched, its form absorbing the blow. Kael darted to the side, his dagger flashing as he aimed for the guardian's core. The blade struck true, but the guardian retaliated with a burst of energy that sent Kael flying. "Kael!" Zayn shouted, his heart pounding as he dodged the guardian's next strike. He channeled the energy of the Stone of Singularity, the ground beneath the guardian trembling as a surge of force erupted upward. The guardian staggered, its form flickering as cracks spread across its surface. Zayn focused, drawing on the shadows from the veil of night and the electricity of the conductor's core. The energies swirled together, forming a concentrated burst that struck the guardian with a deafening roar. The guardian let out a final cry before shattering into fragments of light that dissolved into the Nexus. The glowing ring around them faded, and the air grew still once more. Kael nodded, his grin